And that's Sarah Benny, now Sarah Tiam, who was playing Mary Queen of Scots. And on her right, your left, is Heather Watson, who was playing Mary Livingston. And the man in front here is Bill Mickle, Helen Curry's first husband, who is interfering. So I'm so delighted to have you all. I'm so pleased that you have given up the opportunity of watching Euro 2020 in the year 2021. That's going to confuse historians in years to come. But welcome to my fourth and last Zoom presentation for the season. It is extremely good to see you all, and your presence has given me a great sense of purpose throughout the pandemic and helped lots of other organizations and individuals as well. And so to Mary Livingston. One of the most frequent historical misconceptions that I often hear is the claim that the song, The Four Marys, concerns an incident in the life of Mary Queen of Scots, that unfortunate monarch born in Linlithgow Palace on December the 8th, 1542. But I'm afraid there is no connection whatsoever, other than the fact that Mary Stuart did have four ladies in waiting, all called Mary. But the song, which begins, Yestreen the Queen had four Marys, relates to an incident at the Russian court of Peter the Great, where a Scottish woman called Mary Hamilton was executed for the murder of her illegitimate child, perhaps fathered by the Russian monarch himself. The storyline of the song closely matches this incident that happened 130 years after the death of Scotland's Queen. The head of the executed murderess was preserved and displayed in the Kunstkamera, a St. Petersburg palace shown here. It held natural and scientific curiosities. The tale came to the attention of ballad writers in Scotland, and the song probably dates from the mid-18th century. The song mentions Mary Beaton, Mary Seton, Mary Carmichael, and me, but there was no Mary Carmichael at the court of Mary Stuart. Queen Mary's four Marys were Mary Seton and Mary Beaton, but Mary Fleming and Mary Livingston were the other two. All of them were the aristocratic offspring of some of Scotland's leading noble families. This fact was known by Bill Macmillan in 1978 when he commissioned a pub sign featuring an artist's impression of Mary Stuart's companions for his newly named Linlithgow hostelry, The Four Marys. In fact, there are very few known portraits of any of the four Marys. These two may depict Mary Fleming and Mary Beaton, but even that is highly debated. The wall panel in Mary Queen of Scots' house in Jedburgh may have been inspired by those two portraits, but it too, like the Four Marys pub placard, is largely a product of the artist's imagination. There are certainly no known portraits of Mary Livingston, the lady with the closest connection to Linlithgow. She is shown in many forms, but all are later representations. For example, depicting her as a porcelain doll, or on the label of a gin bottle, one of Linlithgow Distillery's Four Marys collection. On her bottle, our Mary is shown dressed in rather kitsch brigadoon fashion. The notes on the reverse of the bottle declare that Mary Livingston was, quote, a lively soul, full of fun, and with an eye for men that made her laugh. I was actually invited along to the local gin manufactory to discuss the historical background of that description, and I was happy to endorse it. I pointed out that this particular Mary Livingston was nicknamed Lusty, and I suggested that Lusty Livingston Liquor would be a good name for the product. The owners disagreed. And so Mary Livingston gin is called Bonnie Bramble, after the locally picked ingredient. Mind you, I doubt whether Mary Livingston ever picked a bramble in her aristocratic life. Born as she was in the prestigious family seat of Callendar House near Falkirk. However, on her father's appointment as keeper of the royal domain and guardian of the infant Queen Mary, she and her mother moved to Linlithgow Palace. Just as a, by the way, I wonder what Mary Livingston would have made of film crews taking over her family seat in order to record the Outlander series, but that's another story. Mary Livingston's father was Alexander, 5th Lord Livingston, and Mary's mother, Agnes Douglas, was his second wife. She was the daughter of the 2nd Earl of Morton, and was, during the first 15 years of the marriage, to produce 8 children. One of those was Mary, probably born in the year 1541. She was the only one of the Queen's Marys who was not actually related in some way to the young ruler, who had assumed the monarchy when she was just 1 week old. It shows how important Mary Livingston's father was, that despite his daughters having no family ties, she was selected by the infant Mary's mother, Marie de Guise, as one of the companions, and later ladies-in-waiting of her young daughter. Alexander had always faithfully served his monarch. He had worked for King James V as commander of the Scottish forces against England, and later was appointed an extraordinary Lord of Session. In 1542, he was named as one of the 8 Lord Keepers of the Queen, Mary, Queen of Scots. And a year later, he became joint custodian of the infant monarch, keeping her safe in Linlithgow Palace from her birth and her baptism, probably in St. Michael's Church, until she was moved to Stirling Castle in 1543, where Alexander continued to be her official protector. He was paid £60 Scots per month for his efforts, a considerable sum then, and rewarded with several titles, meaning that his daughter became second only to Mary Fleming in noble rank. In addition to their aristocratic birth, what Mary Stuart's ladies had in common was their similar age to the Queen. Mary Livingston, remember, maybe just a year older. The girls also shared their Christian name, but whether they were chosen deliberately on account of this is not known. There was a pun involved in the choice of playmates, as Marie was the Scots word for a maid, derived from the Nordic word Maja. Mary Livingston was the first of the Marys to meet the royal babe in arms, and they travelled together as part of the enormous royal retinue which left Linlithgow for Stirling. It is recorded that as the baggage train left on the July 27th, 1543, as the last wagon left the cross, the head of the cavalcade was fording the River Avon at Linlithgow Bridge. Mind you, I've seen marches, parades a bit like that as well, if one band marched particularly slowly. By the way, the X38 bus follows the same royal route today. But Queen Mary in a carriage, her royal procession was accompanied by an armed guard of 3,500 soldiers. The reason for this large military presence was an immediate threat from a possible English invasion, in response to King Henry VIII's desire to forcibly betroth the Scottish Queen to his son, a period of the ongoing Anglo-Scottish wars known as the Rough Wooing. Incidentally, one of the conflicts during that period of Anglo-Scottish aggression, the Battle of Pinkie, led to the death of Mary Livingston's older brother, John. Once established in the Stirling citadel, aged just 10 months, Mary was crowned Queen of Scots in the castle's Chapel Royal on 9th September 1543. She remained in this stronghold for the next 4 years until it was decided to convey her to an isolated Augustinian priory on Inchmahome Island in the middle of the Lake of Menteith. Several of Mary's ancestors had stayed there, including King Robert the Bruce, her 5 times great-grandfather, and Linlithgow's charter-bestowing benefactor, King Robert II. It was here for the first time all 5 Marys assembled, and they stayed on Inchmahome from September 9th, 1547, until early July 1548, a fairly short period of time, but long enough, it would seem, for a little boxwood summer house situated amidst a copse of trees to be called Queen Mary's Bower, a nomenclature popularised by Sir Walter Scott in his novel Rob Roy. Another character, by the way, who some 165 years later was also to hide out on the island. With the English king's aggression showing no signs of abating, and with the arrival in Scotland of some 6,000 French troops to help Mary's mother fight an English army, it was decided to move the threatened monarch and her 4 young companions to France. Once the French fleet of galleys had disembarked the above-mentioned soldiers at Leith, it continued round the north of Scotland and down the west coast. Queen Mary and her retinue were waiting in Dumbarton Castle, and hasty preparations were made for them to go aboard the waiting oared galleys. What must the 7-year-old Mary Livingston have made of the sight of slaves rowing her ship down the Clyde? It's interesting to consider that one of the slaves chained to their rowing stations could have been John Knox, who had been captured when a French force had taken St Andrew's Castle. As a punishment, Knox was indeed made to row a French galley. However, he was not on any of the 4 vessels that sailed with Mary Stuart and her entourage. At that exact moment in time, Knox was rowing up the River Loire in France. The weather in Scotland was fairly calm, but even with reasonable conditions, many on board the royal ship became seasick as their vessel sailed into the Kyles of Bute. Lady Fleming, the Queen's aunt, felt so bad that she begged to be dropped off on the island. The ship's captain, Nicolas de Villegagnon, rebuked her, pointing out that they could not take the chance of stopping, as it was possible that an English fleet was giving chase. His actual comment was, "Madame, you must proceed to France or jump off and drown on the way. Your condition is not unique. There are even male courtiers on board in the same condition." Once out on the open sea, the sails were unfurled and the slaves were able to rest a little. However, galleys under sail were at the mercy of gusting winds, and conditions worsened during the 6-day voyage, resulting in Mary Livingston and the other Marys all suffering from malade de mer. The young Queen felt fine and enjoyed teasing her friends about their increasingly green-hued condition. The man entrusted by French King Henry II to bring the Scots Queen and her Marys to France was Louis de Breze. There exists a letter written by him to Mary of Guise, telling her that her daughter had safely arrived at Roscoff in Brittany. In the epistle he writes, "La reine, votre fille a été moins malade sur la mer que personne de sa compagnie, de sorte qu'elle se moquait de ce qu'il était," confirming what has just been said about Mary making fun of her companions heaving over the side. At least Mary Fleming had her mother with her to offer sympathy, and Mary Livingston had both her father and her mother, who were traveling to France as guardian and governess. The other 2 Marys were on their own to endure what de Breze calls l'air d'un poisson pas très frais, what we would call green about the gills. Upon their arrival in France, the positions of Mary Queen of Scots and that of her young ladies in waiting could not have been made any clearer. Queen Mary was to join Henry II's children in the royal Valois nursery, whilst the other Marys were separated from her. This might appear as a cruel move by the French king, but it was for the young Scottish Queen's benefit. First of all, if, as many hoped, she were to marry the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, she would need to learn to speak fluent French and be associated with the Valois princesses Elizabeth and Claude. Secondly, by making Henry's daughters her closest companions, he could secure her loyalty and ensure that she was surrounded by women of noble birth and of respectable character. The Queen's 4 Scottish companions were duly sent away to the Dominican Priory of Saint Louis in the town of Poissy, not far to the north of Linlithgow's twin town of Guyancourt. The monastic establishment was at the forefront of Renaissance learning, and the nuns there amongst the most learned women in Europe. Mary Livingston received a thorough education and learned the skills necessary to be the attendant on a queen and the future wife of someone of noble birth. So the Dominican nuns trained the girls in the refined arts, French and Italian, music, embroidery, deportment, and even some polite dancing. Mary Livingston, at her own request, was also taught to write poetry, and she was given permission to go riding and hunting in the French countryside, especially in the forest of Saint-Germain. She became a fine horsewoman with a great love of the outdoors. Sadly, very little is left of Mary Livingston's educational establishment, as it fell foul of the French Revolution, when it was attacked, looted, and destroyed. Only the gardens and a baptismal font remain, along with the gatehouse, which is now the home of a toy museum. After 6 years apart, the Marys were eventually reunited. On January 1st, 1554, at the age of 11, Queen Mary was given her own household, marking the informal end of her childhood. She began to attend court more often, taking ceremonial roles in public, and generally beginning a different sort of training, one that prepared her for a future as a ruling monarch with a rightful claim to the throne of England. Her 4 Marys left Poissy and were allowed to join her as ladies in waiting. This illustration is from a cheesy American TV drama called Reign. In addition to the 4 Marys, Mary Stuart was also served by a large retinue of courtiers and officials. And the question arose as to who was going to pay for it all. It was decided that the French treasury would pay the bill for accommodation, while the Scottish government had to pay the living expenses of all Mary's court, not a popular decision in many parts of the Scots nation. Along with her companions and royal mistress, Mary Livingston lived in various palatial establishments, enjoying the luxurious lifestyle and the vivacious whirl of music, dancing, and feasting. Much of the time was spent in the Château d'Amboise in the Loire Valley, Mary Livingston's favourite habitation, a place said to loosely resemble Linlithgow's royal residence. Mary Stuart's mother, Marie de Guise, had favourably compared her much-loved Linlithgow Palace with Amboise, saying they were both, quote, pleasure palaces surrounded by scenic waters. I leave you to judge. Incidentally, Mary of Guise died today in the year 1560. We have very little in the way of evidence about how the 4 Marys lived their French existence. There are some apocryphal stories, one where Mary Livingston was stopped on the way to the Queen's chamber, carrying a concoction of oranges, which the royal chef had prepared to tempt the ailing Queen of Scots. On being asked what she was taking to her mistress, Mary Livingston replied, Mary is ill, speaking in French, Marie est malade, thus giving rise to the word marmalade. This is not true. The dish was known about in Portugal in the 15th century and called marmelada. But we do have one authentic written extract describing a true occasion which took place in 1555, when a classical ballet was staged to welcome King Henry back to the Chateau of Fontainebleau. Mary Livingston was dressed as a satyr and given the role of addressing the king's sister, Marguerite de Valois, speaking in French, in which language she was extremely proficient. Translated, she said, the waves of the ocean have not produced a pearl of such price as yourself, the unique and pure Marguerite. We don't know how impressed the French king and his sister were at Mary Livingston's performance. However, we do know that Mary did not impress one of the Queen's relatives, Mary Stuart's grandmother, the formidable Antoinette de Bourbon, Duchess of Guise. We know that this lady wrote to her daughter, Marie de Guise, declaring that she was certain that Mary Livingston was not as thoroughly washed as was desirable. A comment perhaps on the Scottish hygiene routine at the time. Or had Mary been energetically dancing, or just in from hunting? Or was the 62-year-old Duchess just being thoroughly unpleasant? King Henry II was determined to marry the Scots Queen to his sickly son, Francois, Mary's childhood friend, with whom she had grown up in the royal nursery. The liaison would cement the relationship between France and Scotland. A secret treaty signed in Mary Livingston's birthplace, Callendar House, confirmed that, in return for French assistance against England, on the marriage of Mary and Francois, the two nations would be united as one. And so the 15-year-old Mary and the 14-year-old Dauphin were duly betrothed on 19th April 1558. They married just 5 days later in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Walking on the arm of the French king, Mary Stuart looked stunning in a breathtaking white dress, heavily embroidered with shimmering diamonds, with a lengthy train of a bluish-grey cut velvet, richly embroidered with white silk and pearls. It measured 12 yards long and was held by 6 attendants, including Mary Fleming and Mary Livingston. White was an audacious choice for the dress, as it was usually the colour of mourning for French royals. But Queen Mary was determined. The colour would represent her purity and virginity. A wonderful gold crown, richly encrusted with precious stones, sat on her flowing auburn hair. The crowds gathered outside the church gasped at the sight and speculated on how much the huge ruby in the centre of the crown must have cost. Estimates put it at 500,000 écus, over £1 million today. We have no record of what Mary Livingston wore to the wedding, but it was no doubt on a par with the other female aristocrats who attended. Diane de Poitiers and Catherine de Medici, for example, were attired in splendidly elaborate gowns, blazing with jewels and pearls, and many other women competed with them for elegance and sophistication. But even more extravagantly dressed was Mary's uncle, Francis, Duke of Guise, fresh from a victory against an English army when he had recaptured Calais, scarred in battle. In full over-the-top military regalia, he struck a dashing figure, much applauded by the onlookers. He was even more popular when, as evening fell at the end of the ceremony, he threw handfuls of gold and silver coins into the crowd, causing something of a riot as people dived and fought for the largesse, a veritable pour out. And doesn't every wedding need an embarrassing uncle? The verdict is out on whether Mary's marriage was ever consummated, and Mary Livingston wasn't telling, although she did have inside information, as she or another of the Queen's ladies slept in the same bedroom as their mistress, or just outside the door. Just a year after the wedding, Mary found herself Queen of France. Her father-in-law, Henry II, had been killed following a jousting tournament against de Lorche, Count of Montgomery, the captain of the King's Scots Guards. In the course of the jousting, the lance had splintered and a shard penetrated the king's eye, as shown in this contemporary German cartoon. However, Mary's time as La Reine de la France only lasted 17 months. Her husband, the new King Francis II, developed a brain tumor, or possibly meningitis, and died. He was buried in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, and the grieving Mary was told that it was customary for the Queen of France to ride in the first processional carriage on the way to the funeral. Mary pointed out that she was no longer Queen of France, and that she would ride behind the dead monarch's mother, Catherine de Medici. Accompanying Mary in the coach was the weeping Mary Livingston. Mary found herself largely replaced by the new regime and out of favour with her mother-in-law, Catherine, who was now regent to the new 10-year-old boy king, Francis's brother, Charles. After a few months of being largely ignored, the Queen of Scots felt that she had no option but to return to Scotland, where she was still a queen, and she duly informed her entourage of her decision. Mary Livingston complained bitterly that she'd only been given a few months to pack. And she was also, like her mistress, heading back to the nation of her birth, both with some reluctance, as they had heard tales of the poor weather and of religious upheaval. The sea crossing was less traumatic on this passage, and Mary's ship made good time, arriving at Leith on August 19th, 1561, before the welcoming committee had time to assemble. She stepped ashore onto a foggy Scottish quayside. She did not wade ashore with her four Marys at Seacliff, as depicted here in a still from the 2018 movie starring Saoirse Ronan, with Mary Livingston played by Leah O'Prey. That night, Mary dined in Leith and was visited by various Scottish nobles, who treated her with some degree of pomp and dignity. With the other Queen's companions, Mary Livingston continued to stay close to the 19-year-old monarch. The Marys all had dedicated stools placed in her royal chambers in Holyrood House and at Linlithgow Palace, an extraordinary honour in those days. Mary Livingston did her best to help her Queen, playing on the virginals for visiting ambassadors and taking leading roles in the court entertainments, which the Queen enjoyed. All of this, of course, to the horror of Protestant preacher John Knox, who took an active dislike to Mary Livingston. To make matters worse, as an excellent singer and dancer, Mary Livingston excelled at masques, which were extravagant evenings of entertainment involving music and dancing, singing and acting, with elaborate costumes and ornate stage sets. Mary also accompanied her Queen and members of the nobility whilst out riding, hunting and hawking. The Queen was fond of the smallest British bird of prey, the merlin, while Mary Livingston preferred a falcon, which she had helped to train. She sometimes wore men's breeches while engaged in outdoor pursuits, further outraging the Protestant leaders. It came to the reformers' ears that Mary Livingston had dressed in male clothing at a banquet in Holyrood, which had been prepared for the French ambassador. If true, it was probably part of a dressing up costume worn to participate in a masque, but it was all too much for John Knox. Referring to her attractiveness and coquettish ways, he christened her Lusty Livingston and spread rumours that she had been made pregnant by a courtier called John Semple, the son of a Scot exiled in England. In actual fact, after Semple proposed to Mary, the couple were engaged for a year before they got married in 1565. And it was a year after that before their first child was born. Another story going about was that Mary Livingston would join Queen Mary in dressing up as burgesses' wives and walking around the principal towns of the realm, even shopped in local markets. Did they do this in Linlithgow, I wonder, when they came to stay on the 11th September 1561? This was Mary's first visit back to her birthplace since she had left the town, and it must have been tinged with sadness, as just 2 years previously the Protestant lords had arrived and cleansed St. Michael's of all symbols of the Roman Catholic religion. Rubble from that destructive visit still littered the ground around the church and the entrance archway, which had been built on the orders of the Queen's father. Did Mary glance over, I wonder, at the now blocked up doorway through which she had perhaps been carried to her christening in St. Michael's? One historical explanation offered for the rhyme Mary, Mary, quite contrary is that it carries religious allegorical references to the belief that Queen Mary would bring back all of the Roman Catholic symbols attacked at the Reformation, symbols like the silver Sanctus bells rung at the elevation of the host, the cockle shells handed to pilgrims at the shrine of St. James in Compostela, and depicted on the French Order of Chivalry carved on the Kirkgate arch. And of course, the pretty maids who accompanied their mistress to Mass, including Mary Livingston. After their visit in 1561, Mary and her maids spent no more than 2 or 3 nights in the palace until 1565, when they stayed for an extended period of time throughout December. At a pre-Christmas festivity, to Mary Livingston's disappointment, it was Mary Fleming who discovered a hidden dried bean inside a cake, thus entitling her to be elected as Queen of the Bean, in charge of some of the Yuletide entertainment within the palace. Although Mary Livingston was animated and pretty, Fleming was generally considered to be the most attractive of the 4 Marys, the flower of the flock. We have a record of one such Yuletide entertainment, when an enchanted fortress was attacked by Moors, centaurs, fiends, and satyrs. And this caused an international incident when the satyrs wiggled their bottoms at a visiting English delegation. Mary Livingston may not have been Queen of the Bean, but she was the one to whom Queen Mary granted the honour of mistress of the monthly cloths, in charge of providing menstrual necessities. This task gave her intimate knowledge of the Queen's pregnancies and the turmoil which surrounded them. Between 1565 and 1566, Mary Livingston was witness to many of the tumultuous events that overshadowed Queen Mary's reign. She was up early on the morning of Sunday, 29th July, 1565, to help prepare her royal mistress for her wedding to her 19-year-old cousin, Henry Darnley. The nuptials began at 6 a.m. in the private chapel in the palace of Holyrood House. The Queen, still in mourning for her first husband, wore a simple white deuil blanc dress, but was outshone by the gorgeously apparelled groom, who was clad in doublet and breeches, covered in gold and silver thread and studded with jewels. Within the chapel, Darnley placed a diamond ring on his bride's finger. Then the Protestant ceremony ended. Darnley then left before the nuptial mass, not wishing to be too closely associated with Roman Catholic rites, which would see him face a charge of idolatry from the Protestant nobles, whom he wished to have on his side. Mary Livingston did attend the mass and a lavish wedding feast which followed, and she duly ate her way through the 16 dishes of game, chicken, lamb, and various sweetmeats, followed by music and dancing. She would note how much the Queen was in love with the man that the monarch herself described as the properest and best proportioned long man that I have ever seen. At 6 feet in height, Mary did not often meet men taller than her. What followed the wedding was 3 days of celebration, at which Mary Livingston vigorously participated, as always reveling in the music, dancing, and display of costumes. She was accompanied on the dance floor by John Semple, her husband of just 4 months. The Queen had actually paid for much of their wedding and had herself attended the elaborate ceremony, during which she presented the couple with the gift of a bed, hung with black velvet and embroidered gold thread. She also bestowed on the happy pair grants of landed estates, including the island of Little Cumbria and the barony of Auchtermuchty. The material and jewellery for Lady Livingston's wedding dress was also provided by the Queen, who additionally laid on an elaborate wedding mask. All of this, to quote John Knox, luxury and lurid licentiousness naturally drew the fury of the Protestant reformer, who claimed that the wedding showed the monarchy's frivolous extravagance and its cronyism in lavishing expensive items on those and such as those, all at the nation's expense and all far too prodigal and profligate. Knox was also opposed to Queen Mary's marriage, and indeed he was against female rulers of any kind. Blazing arguments ensued between Mary and Knox, most overheard by Mary Livingston. Knox must have been delighted when it became apparent that Mary Stuart's marriage was on the rocks. All too soon, the Scottish Queen realised that she had married an egotistical, self-absorbed narcissist with ambitions to be the principal monarch of Scotland. Mary Livingston must have witnessed the quarrels, the king's childish temper, his arrogant posturing and growing jealousy, and the increasing alienation of the royal couple. It came to a head in the supper room of Holyrood House on 9th March 1566. This is a scene from that recent Mary Queen of Scots movie, with the Queen's companions depicted sitting on their royally appointed stools and listening to Mary's secretary and confidant, David Rizzio, playing on the lute. The heavily pregnant Queen had just finished eating when in burst a group of rebel lords who stabbed a terrified Rizzio multiple times as the unfortunate musician clung to the skirts of his royal patroness until he was dragged away. The Queen was certain that the jealous Darnley was responsible for the act, and plans began to formulate in her mind regarding how to get rid of her troublesome husband. However, that had to wait until Mary delivered her baby. The birth occurred on 19th June 1566 in Edinburgh Castle, and again Mary Livingston was in attendance. King Henry was nowhere to be seen, and his absence caused the alienation between him and his wife to deepen. Queen Mary later received word that her errant husband was in Glasgow and unwell, reportedly suffering from the pox, in all likelihood a sexually transmitted disease. Feigning concern, the Queen and Mary Livingston travelled through to the west and brought Darnley on the way back to Edinburgh, staying overnight in Linlithgow Palace. Was Mary Livingston aware that secret plans were possibly being hatched in the very building where her father had been charged with the protection and guardianship of the infant Queen? Whatever was discussed inside the walls of the Stuart residence, within a month, Darnley was dead. His Edinburgh residence, Kirkafield, blown up, and his strangled body found in the garden. This contemporary drawing shows the demolished building, the body of Darnley and his servant, and Darnley's son, James, on the top left, calling for vengeance. Suspicion for the murder fell on James Hebburn, the Earl of Bothwell, played in the most recent movie by Martin Compson. Had Bothwell visited Mary in Linlithgow Palace and planned the whole event? Many thought so and speculated over what he might do next. Mary Livingston was soon to find out. Along with the Queen, she paid her last visit to Linlithgow Palace on April 22nd, 1567. The next day, as the royal retinue rode towards Edinburgh, the Scottish monarch was abducted by Bothwell and taken off, supposedly reluctantly, to Dunbar Castle, where he had his wicked way with her, thereby forcing a marriage. What did Mary Livingston make of all that? There followed civil war and the Battle of Carberry Hill, where Mary Livingston and Mary Seton persuaded the Queen to surrender in order to avoid Scottish bloodshed. Mary did so, and on the promise of safe conduct was led back into Edinburgh, where she was subjected to taunts from the hostile crowd, some carrying placards depicting her as a mermaid, a sorceress who had lured her husband to his death and then married the murderer. Hebburn, the murderer, depicted here by the letter H, and his family crest, the hare. The beleaguered Queen was allowed to enter her bedchamber in Holyrood, where Mary Livingston and Mary Seton served her supper. The Queen had hardly eaten anything for 2 days. Before she was finished, however, she was told she was going to leave. And before Mary Livingston could pack for her, under cover of darkness, the Queen and her maid were carried away by armed men to imprisonment in the grim, secluded castle on the island of Loch Leven. And there, soon after, weak from miscarrying twin children, her signature to an abdication was extorted from her. It was there that Mary Livingston last saw her Queen, before her royal mistress escaped and set about gathering support for her cause. While Mary Livingston went back to her husband to live in Beltree's Castle in Renfrewshire, southwest of Paisley, Queen Mary lost the Battle of Langside, fled to England, and into imprisonment in a number of English castles. Only Mary Seton accompanied the exiled Queen south of the border and stayed with her for some years, enduring the discomfort of cold, damp keeps. Mary Livingston's last connection with her Queen was when she sent some of her mistress's jewels to the Queen in Bolton Castle. Her actions displeased the man left in charge of Scotland, the Regent Lennox, and he demanded that Mary Semple, as he referred to her, hand over all the Queen's jewels which had been entrusted to her. When Mary refused, her husband, John Semple, was arrested and imprisoned for a time in Blackness Castle, guilty of having no sway over his wife. He was eventually released, and Mary bore at least 4 children to him, one of them being James Semple, who was brought up alongside the young King James VI and taught in the royal nursery by George Buchanan. Later, he received an education in St Andrews University and became an ambassador to England for 9 years, until 1600, when he was knighted by King James who also presented him with a jeweled necklace which had belonged to Queen Mary. When Mary Livingston died is not known for certain. It is unlikely that she lived to hear of the death of her queen in 1587, although the Victorian historian Agnes Strickland claimed she had found reference to Mary being alive in 1592, so she may have done. But not one of the four Marys was actually present at the execution, as the only one who had journeyed to England, Mary Seton, had retired to a nunnery in France. So it was other women who on the day removed Mary Stuart's black cloak to reveal an underdress of scarlet, the colour of martyrdom. Another tied a white cloth around the Queen's eyes. And so it was these new ladies, Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl, who watched the axe descend 3 times and the life of the Queen of Scots come to its cruel end. Her rosary beads and the Bible she carried to her execution were given to the foremost Catholic family in England, the Howards. Recently, these were stolen from the display cabinet in Arundel Castle, where they were on show. To date, there is no news of their whereabouts, a huge loss to Scottish history. Mary's body was embalmed and buried under Peterborough Cathedral, until it was later exhumed on the orders of her son, then King James VI and first. It was reburied in the Henry VII Chapel of Westminster Abbey. A death mask impression of her face was taken in wax, the original now kept in Lennox Love House near Haddington. No records exist of where Mary Livingston was laid to rest. The Livingston family burial crypt was in an underground vault, later enclosed by the stone-built annex seen on the right of the left-hand illustration of St. Michael's Church. The actual construction was removed in the late 19th century, thereby exposing the stone slab covering the entrance to the Livingston tomb. A heavy metal mortsafe was dragged across the entrance, and on the wall behind, a plaque was affixed, recording the known occupants of the vault beneath: George Livingston, 3rd Earl of Linlithgow, and 2 of his wives, another George, the 4th Earl, and his 5-year-old daughter, Henrietta. In 1980, the tomb was broken into, and the robbers ransacked the burials in search of valuables, or perhaps just to steal the lead. The then Minister of St. Michael's, Ian Patterson, who I'm delighted to say is listening in tonight with his wife Lorna, contacted me and suggested that I might help with the identification of the coffins and the ensuring that when they were resealed, the carved lead inscriptions would be fixed to the correct casket. I took some 6-year historians with me, and they were certainly fascinated. You will both note that Ian and I were a little younger then, but that's history for you. But to be serious, bravely the pupils all descended into the underground vault and witnessed the grisly scene. There were the Livingstons' lead coffins, ripped open, the skeletons pulled asunder. One girl picked up the skull of the 3rd Earl, who had died in 1690, and she became obviously very moved. Perhaps she was aware that, for the first time in her young life, she was actually holding history in her hands. I asked her why she was so affected, and she eventually explained that she had read up on the character whose skull she was holding. Amongst other facts, she recalled that he was the great-nephew of Mary Livingston, one of the 4 Marys. As we were about to leave the vault, one of my students, a girl, stepped back into a far corner and began to sink into very soft sand. I will never forget her scream. We helped her remove her shoe from the soft soil, and Bill Benny discovered beneath it another lead coffin, one of several buried in an earlier layer. Sadly, there were no markings or coat of arms on the casket, so there was no way of precisely identifying whose remains it contained. However, when I reported our discovery to the Reverend David Steele, a former minister of St. Michael's, he told me that he had done some research into the last days of Mary Livingston and was convinced that she had indeed been laid to rest in the Livingston burial vault beneath St. Michael's. So was this the last resting place of the wonderful Mary Livingston? I do hope so. back close to where she began her full and remarkable life, and in the shadow of the birthplace of the Queen she so devotedly served, Linlithgow's Mary Livingston. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Bruce. Fantastic.
That was absolutely wonderful. Really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting thing, Bruce. About a year and a half ago,
Yep.
I attended a meeting in the New Club of a convention of the Scottish Baronet. There was a lady there who was currently the Baroness of Livingston, having bought the title during the expansion of the after the 2004 Feudal Reform Act detached the dignity from the lands.
Right.
And she was apparently, and she told me she had been in Linlithgow donating money to create a proper memorial to the Livingston family.
Yeah, I know of that.
Yeah,
There's a big American contingent of Livingstons
yeah.
who are behind this idea as well. I'm not sure what happened to it, but it would be an interesting memorial.
Yeah, yeah,
And if we can prove that one of them is Mary Livingston, that would be wonderful.
yeah.
Ian, hope you enjoyed that, Ian Patterson.
Very much so, very much.
Lovely to see you.
Oh, lovely to listen in. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lorna. A lot of research, the internet has helped hugely, but it still needs a lot of searching and library visiting.
I think you're extremely modest, Bruce. It takes a great deal of effort to put together a talk like
Takes
that.
a while, but then
Yes.
for the last 18 months, I've had a bit of time in my hands.
Hi, was Mary Livingston the most famous of the four Marys?
Of course she was, because she's got the Linlithgow connection. Helena's my granddaughter, by the way. She's been primed to ask me a nice question.
Are there any Livingstons still in Falkirk?
David, where's David? David, who's done some work, David Elliott, on the Calendar House papers. Are there any Livingstons still around? Nobody close. I think America, a lot of them emigrated to America. And of course, at the 1715 Jacobite rebellion, the Livingstons joined the wrong side and were attainted. They had all their lands and titles taken away and handed to the Forfeited Estates Commission. So they were not persona grata in Scotland. So I think a lot of them emigrated.
I just wanted to say that was absolutely phenomenal, Dad.
Well, thank you.
And-
Oh, you've not got a legal question, Mark.
No, phenomenal. Phenomenal presentation. It's genuinely lovely to see people like Ian Patterson here
It was good.
on the call as well, because I remember with great fondness the watch night ceremonies under Ian's presidings.
It's never been the same, Ian. Never been the same.
It never has. The watch night ceremonies with Ian Patterson, phenomenal. But Dad, that was absolutely phenomenal.
It was
It
wonderful.
was, yes. Yeah.
Down once again, thank you very much, Bruce. That was really entertaining. And
Thank you, Bruce.
absolutely excellent.
Thank you.